In the sun-bleached landscape of Santa Monica, California, there stands a building of profound and deliberate anonymity. The Princess Eugenia Apartments, a three-story structure of white stucco and unremarkable design, bakes under the Pacific sun just 2 blocks from the ocean. It is a place built for the transient rhythms of coastal life, for people who come and go without leaving a trace. Its architecture speaks not of permanence or power, but of the simple, functional desire to blend in, to become part of a landscape so vast and uniform that individual identity dissolves into the collective whole. Within this monument to the mundane, apartment number 303 exists as a silent testament to a story that has already ended. The number on the door, a simple metallic plate, once served as the final threshold between a fabricated world and a monstrous reality. Today, the hallway outside is quiet, disturbed only by the distant hum of traffic and the muffled sounds of lives that have since moved in. The door, now locked against a history rather than an intruder, guards a space that has been scrubbed clean but can never be truly empty. To step inside now is to enter a void. The air is sterile, carrying the faint chemical scent of industrial cleaners and fresh paint, a desperate attempt to whitewash the years of silent, suffocating tension that soaked into the drywall. The cheap, rent-controlled carpet shows no indentations from furniture that once anchored a meticulous lie. The space is a hollow echo, a curated emptiness where every surface has been stripped of the evidence it once held, leaving only the ghost of a meticulously crafted normalcy. This was the final stage for an empire built on blood and betrayal, a kingdom intentionally shrunk to the dimensions of a 2-bedroom apartment. There were no gilded thrones or marble columns, only the unassuming props of a quiet retirement. One can almost picture the modest furniture, the paperback novels stacked on a nightstand, the ceramic figurines collecting dust on a shelf. It was the carefully constructed habitat of Charles and Carol Gasco, a retired couple living out their golden years in the California sun, a fiction so complete it deceived neighbors for over a decade. The apartment's location was its most potent weapon. Santa Monica is a geography of reinvention, a place where pasts are shed like old skin. For the man inside, it was not a new beginning but a calculated end, a fortress of invisibility hidden in plain sight. He weaponized the sun, the sea breeze, and the easygoing anonymity of Southern California, turning the idyllic surroundings into the perfect camouflage for a predator who had gone to ground. The contrast was absolute, an open, optimistic world outside and a closed, paranoid universe within. The property itself was more than a hideout. It was a co-conspirator. It did not merely house its occupant, it enabled him, protected him, and became an extension of his own psyche. For 16 years it held its breath, its thin walls absorbing the silent routines, the whispered conversations, and the crushing weight of a life lived on a razor's edge. This was not a home that offered comfort or respite. It was a tool, a bunker disguised as a residence, a living entity, complicit in the final desperate act of a notorious fugitive. Its walls are the central metaphor of this entire story. They were not the thick, fortified barriers of a traditional stronghold, but the hollow, flimsy partitions of modern construction. Their very fragility was their strength, creating a space no one would suspect of containing anything of value, let alone the secrets of one of America's most wanted men. They were membranes, designed to separate the placid domesticity of the Gascos from the latent violence of Whitey Bulger. The silence that permeated this space was not peaceful. It was the tense, predatory quiet of a hunter's blind. Every mundane sound from the outside world, a neighbor's television, a passing car, children playing in the courtyard, was a potential threat to be analyzed and dismissed. The atmosphere within was one of constant low-grade vigilance, a state of readiness for a confrontation that could erupt at any moment. The tranquility of the apartment was a lie, a thin veneer stretched taut over an arsenal of violence and a fortune in cash. This was a prison of his own design, its bars forged not from steel, but from routine and discipline. The daily choreography of life as Charles Gasco was a sentence of perpetual performance. Every trip to the grocery store, every polite nod to a neighbor, was a calculated act in a long-running play. The apartment was the backstage area and the cell block combined, a space where the mask could be set aside. but the psychological confinement was absolute and unrelenting. Unlike the ostentatious palaces of other criminal titans, this space was an architectural statement of negation. It was defined entirely by what it lacked: no opulence, no grandeur, no displays of wealth. Its power was derived from its deliberate rejection of the very symbols that define a criminal empire. This was not the architecture of ambition, but the architecture of erasure. It was a void meticulously constructed to swallow a man's identity, a tomb built to house a ghost. Today, new tenants live within these walls, likely unaware that their home is a historical artifact, a silent museum of a collapsed world. They sleep, eat, and live their lives in a space that was once the final redoubt of a sociopathic king. The story is not on the surface, it is embedded in the very structure of the building. A psychic residue left behind in the wood and plaster, a lingering echo of paranoia and control. The apartment at the Princess Eugenia succeeded in its mission for nearly 2 decades, presenting a flawless facade of unremarkable life. Its quiet ordinariness was its shield, its normalcy the most impenetrable armor. From the outside, it was just another door in another hallway, a place easily overlooked and instantly forgotten. The illusion was perfect, a masterpiece of deception painted with the drab colors of everyday existence. Luxury was just the surface. What happened inside, few dared to know. Subscribe to unravel the layers of a meticulously constructed lie. Before the sterile white walls of Santa Monica, there were the weathered brick facades of South Boston. This was the original fortress, a self-contained world of triple-decker houses and narrow streets huddled against the Atlantic. It was a geography of tribal loyalty, a working-class Irish-American enclave where the unwritten laws of the neighborhood carried more weight than any statute passed on Beacon Hill. The architecture itself was a statement of insularity, a labyrinth designed to confuse outsiders and protect its own, fostering a code of silence as thick as the winter fog rolling in from the harbor. This was the crucible that forged James Bulger. He was not an anomaly born into this world, but its logical product. Poverty was the ambient condition, a constant grinding pressure that taught the first and most lasting lesson. Power was the only real currency, and it was seized, never given. The streets were a brutal classroom where survival depended on a quick mind and a capacity for violence that was both strategic and absolute. To be soft was to be a victim, a resource to be consumed by those who were not. His first crimes were not grand ambitions, but elemental acts of territorial dominance. They were the crude, unrefined expressions of a will that would later become terrifyingly sophisticated. Stealing, fighting, and intimidation were the vernacular of power in South Boston, a language he mastered with chilling proficiency. Each successful act of coercion, each adversary left broken or afraid, was a brick laid in the foundation of a psychological structure built to insulate him from the world's indifference. He was learning to build walls around himself long before he would ever need to hide inside them. The desire for a sanctuary, a place of ultimate control, was not yet an architectural concept but a nascent psychological imperative. It grew from the deep-seated understanding that the world was fundamentally hostile, a chaotic theater of threats that had to be managed or eliminated. Every interaction was a calculation of risk and advantage. Trust was a vulnerability, loyalty a tool to be weaponized. The neighborhood itself, with its fierce internal cohesion and deep suspicion of outsiders, provided the blueprint for his own developing psyche. His early trajectory led him not to a palace, but to a penitentiary, a place that would refine his instincts into a cold, hard philosophy. A string of armed robberies landed him in federal prison, and eventually on the cold stone anvil of Alcatraz. The Rock was more than a prison. It was an architectural experiment in sensory deprivation, designed to crush the human spirit. Surrounded by the frigid, impassable waters of the San Francisco Bay, it was the ultimate expression of external control, a place from which there was no physical escape. It was within those infamous walls that the most significant fracture may have occurred. As an inmate, Bulger was allegedly subjected to the CIA's MKUltra program, a series of clandestine experiments involving the administration of LSD and other psychoactive drugs. The program's goal was mind control, the ultimate violation of an individual's sovereignty. For a man already obsessed with control, this experience would have been a foundational trauma, a terrifying confirmation that the enemy was not just outside the gates, but could invade the mind's last sanctuary. This alleged violation forged a new kind of paranoia, one that was no longer just a street-smart survival tactic, but a core principle of his being. If the very architecture of his consciousness could be breached by an unseen institutional power, then no physical fortress could ever be truly secure on its own. The need for absolute control became pathological. He learned that the only way to be safe was to become a ghost, to operate from the shadows, and to build a defense so total that it bordered on invisibility. When he emerged from prison, he was a different animal. The raw aggression of his youth had been tempered into a disciplined, methodical patience. He returned to South Boston not just as a hardened criminal, but as a strategist who understood that true power lay not in open confrontation, but in covert manipulation. He had seen the system from the inside, recognized its vulnerabilities, and now sought to turn its immense power to his own advantage. He began to assemble the Winter Hill Gang not as a simple street crew, but as an extension of his own will, a human fortress built on fear and a twisted form of loyalty that flowed only in one direction. He demanded absolute fealty, but offered none in return, viewing his associates as assets to be managed and, if necessary, liquidated. His authority was absolute, maintained through a reputation for a cruelty that was both theatrical and deeply personal. He did not simply eliminate threats, he erased them, often taking part in the murders himself to reinforce his control. The accumulation of wealth was secondary to the accumulation of power. Money was a tool, a means to an end, but the end itself was an existence free from external control. He had no desire for the ostentatious displays that characterized other crime lords. A gaudy mansion in the suburbs would have been a monument to his ego, but also a target, a fixed position for his enemies to attack. He understood that visibility was a liability. His ambition was far more sophisticated. He sought to build an empire that was felt, but not seen, a network of influence that permeated the city's underworld and corrupted its official institutions. He would not build a castle of stone and steel in Boston, but rather an invisible fortress of information and fear. This was the period where he cultivated his relationship with the FBI, turning the nation's premier law enforcement agency into his private army against the rival Italian mafia. He was parasitizing the system, hollowing it out from within to serve his own ends. This strategy was a direct consequence of the lessons learned in Alcatraz. If the system could invade his mind, he would invade its very heart. He would become an informant not out of weakness, but as an act of supreme control, using the government's power to eliminate his enemies, while his own crimes were deliberately ignored. This period of his ascent in Boston was the true genesis of the Santa Monica apartment. The two-bedroom hideout was not a desperate afterthought conceived in a moment of panic. It was the logical conclusion of a life spent perfecting the art of disappearance. The need for such a place was being coded into his DNA, with every betrayal he engineered, every secret he kept, and every act of violence he committed from the shadows. The concept of a final redoubt, a place of perfect anonymity, was growing in his mind like a quiet obsession. It would be the architectural manifestation of his entire philosophy, a space defined not by what it contained but by what it concealed. It would not be a monument to his power, but the ultimate insurance policy against its loss. The walls of this future sanctuary would not be built of South Boston brick or Alcatraz stone. They would be constructed from the most mundane materials imaginable: stucco, drywall, and the crushing anonymity of modern life. He was learning that the most impenetrable fortress is the one that no one ever notices is there. His rise in Boston was therefore not the construction of an empire, but the meticulous preparation for its eventual inevitable collapse. Every dollar extorted, every rival eliminated, was another resource stockpiled for a life in exile. The seeds of the Princess Eugenia apartments were planted here, in the cold, damp soil of South Boston, watered by paranoia and a profound, abiding distrust of the entire world. The architecture of power that James Bulger would construct was not designed with blueprints and mortar, but with a cold calculus of human weakness. Returning to the familiar streets of South Boston, he carried within him the ghost of Alcatraz, a permanent alteration to his internal schematics. The world was no longer a territory to be conquered with brute force alone. It was a system to be infiltrated, its own structural integrity used as a weapon against itself. The foundation of his new empire would be laid not on a plot of land, but in the minds of his future victims and allies. His first act of construction was to raze the old structures of loyalty and trust that governed the neighborhood's criminal class. He understood that fear was a far more reliable building material. Through a series of calculated and brutal acts, he established a new law of gravity in Southie, one where all things inevitably fell toward him. He did not ask for tribute. He engineered a climate where paying it became an essential act of self-preservation for every bookie, loan shark, and drug dealer operating on his turf. The initial framework of his organization was Spartan and ruthlessly efficient. He surrounded himself with a small insulated crew, men who understood the new rules. Loyalty was not a bond of affection, but a transactional state of being, its value measured daily by its utility. Anyone could be sacrificed to reinforce the structure. This was not a gang, it was a human security system, with each member serving as a sensor, a trigger, or a weapon, all wired directly to his central will. The expansion began not by building outwards, but by hollowing out his rivals from within. He recognized the long simmering war between the Irish gangs and the entrenched Italian patriarcha crime family as a structural opportunity. Where others saw a front line, he saw a vulnerability he could exploit. He would not engage in a war of attrition, but one of surgical demolition, using an external force to do the heavy lifting for him. That external force was the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The recruitment of Whitey Bulger as a top-echelon informant in 1975 was the single most important architectural decision of his career. It was the moment he broke ground on an invisible fortress, one whose walls would be rendered impenetrable by the very institutions sworn to tear them down. His handler, John Connolly, a fellow native of South Boston, was not merely an asset. He was the master key granting Bulger access to the system's most secret corridors. This unholy alliance became the central pillar supporting his entire enterprise. It was a perfect symbiosis of steel and shadow. Bulger fed Connolly a steady stream of high-value intelligence, meticulously curated to cripple the Italian mafia. In return, the FBI provided him with something more valuable than any weapon or vault, a shield of institutional invisibility. He was a ghost in their machine, his own crimes deliberately overlooked, his name redacted from indictments, his presence erased from the official record. With the government acting as his private demolition crew, the empire expanded at an astonishing rate. Each patriarcha capo taken down was a competing structure removed from the landscape, clearing the way for his own silent annexation of their territory and revenue streams. He absorbed their gambling rackets, their extortion networks, and their control over the city's illicit economies, all without firing a shot in a direct confrontation. The construction was silent, efficient, and devastatingly effective. His control was further fortified by a second parallel source of power. His younger brother, William "Billy" Bulger, was the president of the Massachusetts State Senate, a political titan of immense influence. This connection provided a facade of legitimacy, a layer of political insulation that made the criminal enterprise beneath it seem untouchable. The Bulger name echoed in the corridors of the State House, as well as the back alleys of South Boston, creating a psychological fortress that discouraged challenges from both the underworld and the world above. The violence, when it was deployed, was no longer the crude brawling of his youth. It became a form of architectural ornamentation, theatrical and symbolic. Murders were carried out not just to eliminate a threat, but to send a message, to etch a warning into the collective consciousness of the city. Each victim was a gargoyle, placed upon the invisible edifice of his power, a grotesque monument to the consequences of defiance. His reputation for a cruelty that was both personal and methodical became the empire's most effective security system. As the money cascaded in, it did not go toward the construction of a physical palace. Bulger had no interest in the gaudy aesthetics of narco-capitalism. Wealth was not for display, it was for reinforcement. The cash was the electrical wiring and plumbing of the empire, channeled through a network of legitimate businesses, liquor stores, real estate holdings, local shops, that served as a sophisticated laundering system. It kept the enterprise running, funded its operations, and bought the silence and complicity upon which its very existence depended. The empire's true architecture was therefore informational. It was a vast, sprawling network of whispers, secrets, and compromising knowledge. Bulger collected intelligence with the same obsessive discipline he applied to everything else. He knew who was cheating, who was in debt, who had a secret life. This data was his arsenal, allowing him to manipulate allies and enemies alike, to anticipate threats and to neutralize them before they could fully materialize. His power was not in what he owned, but in what he knew. The streets of South Boston themselves became the outer walls of this fortress. The neighborhood's ingrained code of silence, its deep-seated suspicion of outsiders and authority, was weaponized to his advantage. Residents who saw nothing and said nothing were not just bystanders. They were active participants in the construction of his sanctuary, their silence the mortar holding the bricks of his kingdom together. To speak against him was to betray not just a man but the entire tribe. He installed layers of security that were entirely human. He rarely touched drugs or money directly, using his lieutenants as firewalls to insulate himself from the mechanics of his own crimes. Stephen Flemmy, his chief partner, was a critical component of this design, a co-architect and enforcer who handled much of the day-to-day management, allowing Bulger to maintain a strategic distance, observing the operation as its unseen overseer. This period marked the zenith of his control. He moved through Boston like a phantom, his influence felt in every corner of the city's underworld, yet his true nature was visible to only a select few. He had built something far more sophisticated than a mansion. He had constructed an ecosystem, a self-sustaining environment of fear and corruption that permeated the city's very foundations, a structure that was everywhere and nowhere at once. Unlike his contemporaries who built monuments to their own ego, Bulger's masterpiece was a monument to his paranoia. Its design was predicated on the lessons learned in Alcatraz, that true power lay not in visibility, but in the ability to control the flow of information, to operate from the shadows, and to become a ghost long before death. The fortress was not a place you could see or touch. It was a condition, a state of absolute and terrifying dominance. The audacity of the design was breathtaking. He had turned his enemies into his employees, the law into his accomplice, and an entire neighborhood into his castle wall. The structure was a living, breathing entity, constantly monitored and maintained, its defenses tested and reinforced. It was a perfect machine of crime, engineered for maximum profit and minimum exposure, a testament to a strategic genius that was utterly sociopathic. The wealth it generated was not hoarded for a life of luxury, but stockpiled as a contingency fund. Deep within the operational core of this invisible empire, another architectural project was already being conceived in the back of his mind. Every dollar buried, every false identity procured, was a brick for a different kind of structure, a final, desperate redoubt for the day when the walls of the Boston Empire would inevitably come crashing down. He had no grand ballroom, no marble columns, no bulletproof glass protecting a penthouse suite. The material manifestation of his power was found in its deliberate absence. It was in the hushed tones people used when speaking his name, in the averted eyes of businessmen paying their weekly tribute, in the sterile silence of a freshly dug, unmarked grave. His throne was intangible, built from the collective fear of a city held captive. The entire edifice was a paradox, a monument to a man who craved invisibility, a kingdom ruled by a king who refused to be seen. It was a structure built on a foundation of betrayal, its primary architect simultaneously serving as its greatest potential weakness. The alliance with the FBI, the very pillar that allowed for its construction, was also a fault line running deep through its core, one that would one day rupture with catastrophic force. For now, however, the fortress stood seemingly impregnable. Its power was absolute, its reach extensive, its ruler a master of the brutalist architecture of fear. He had remade Boston's underworld in his own image, creating a dark mirror of the city itself, a hidden empire whose existence was an open secret, a whispered truth that no one dared to speak aloud. Which detail best reveals the builder's vanity, the marble ballroom, the bulletproof windows, or the underground vault? The architecture of James Bulger's reign was never rendered in stone or steel. It was an atmospheric construction, a change in the city's barometric pressure that could be felt in every back alley, union hall, and political office. While other criminal titans built monuments to their egos, sprawling estates with high walls and opulent gates, Bulger constructed an empire of influence, its domain mapped not on property deeds, but on the city's circuits of fear and complicity. His palace was Boston itself, its social and political infrastructure hollowed out and rewired to serve as his personal fortress. Power was not a throne upon which he sat, but a climate he engineered. It was the sudden quiet in a tavern when he walked in, the averted gaze of a businessman making a weekly cash drop, the tremor in the voice of a politician discussing a zoning variance. This intangible dominion was far more pervasive and secure than any physical compound. A mansion can be besieged, its walls breached, but an empire that exists in the collective psyche of a city is a far more difficult target to assail. The master blueprint for this phantom kingdom was drawn on government letterhead. The unholy sacrament of his informant deal with the FBI was the true foundation upon which everything was built. This alliance transformed the Bureau from a potential adversary into the Empire's private security force and demolition crew. Each rival gangster arrested, each competing organization dismantled based on his tips, was another wing added to his invisible palace, built with the government's own hands. This structure was reinforced by a second, parallel tower of influence that touched the sky above the city's official landscape. With his brother, William Bulger, presiding over the Massachusetts State Senate, the family name became a symbol of a power so deeply entrenched it seemed a part of the natural order. One brother ruled the night, the other ruled the day. This duality created a near-impenetrable shield, a public facade of legitimacy that made the dark machinery operating behind it seem untouchable. Tribute was collected not in grand ceremonies, but in the quiet, methodical rhythm of extortion that became the empire's lifeblood. Every bookmaker, loan shark, and drug trafficker operating within his territory paid a street tax, a recurring fee for the privilege of their own existence. It was not a negotiation, it was a law of physics. This constant, steady flow of cash was the electrical current that kept the entire invisible edifice humming with power. His court was not a gilded hall, but the back room of the South Boston Liquor Mart on Old Colony Avenue, a drab and functional space that became the nexus of his control. Here, amidst boxes of cheap whiskey and lottery tickets, deals were struck, sentences were passed, and the fates of men were decided. It was a throne room disguised as a stockroom, its utter banality a testament to a power that had no need for the trappings of royalty. More valuable than the cash that flowed through his hands was the information that flowed into his mind. He was a meticulous archivist of human weakness, collecting secrets and vulnerabilities with the obsessive care of a curator. This intelligence was his true treasury, an arsenal of leverage that allowed him to manipulate his environment, anticipate threats, and ensure that everyone within his orbit was bound to him by the weight of what he knew. Violence was the grim statuary that adorned this invisible palace. It was rarely impulsive, but rather a calculated instrument of policy, a form of brutal communication designed to be read by the entire underworld. A murder was not just the elimination of a single problem, it was a public notice, a permanent and grisly reminder of the established boundaries and the absolute cost of transgression. He was not a distant king ordering executions from a high tower. His control was tactile, his cruelty personal. He often participated directly in the murders, a management style that fused the roles of chief executive and frontline executioner. This proximity to the violence was a critical element of his psychological dominance, projecting an aura of a man unbound by any moral or legal constraint, a force of nature that could not be reasoned with. The most grotesque rituals of his reign were reserved for those suspected of the one unforgivable sin, informing. In a chilling act of hypocrisy, the FBI's top echelon informant would torture and murder men he believed were talking to law enforcement. These acts were carried out in secret houses, domestic spaces temporarily converted into abattoirs, their walls absorbing the final. Desperate moments of men who had broken the code he himself betrayed daily. The outer walls of this fortress were built of silence, mortared by the neighborhood's deep-seated code of omertà. South Boston became an extension of the empire, its residents conditioned to see nothing and say nothing. Their silence was not passive, it was an active, essential contribution to his security, a collective conspiracy that transformed an entire district into a buffer zone, protecting the dark heart of the operation within. He cultivated a carefully managed public persona, a piece of social architecture as deliberately constructed as any building. To many in South Boston, he was the neighborhood protector, the man who kept the peace and handed out Thanksgiving turkeys. This Robin Hood myth was a brilliant piece of propaganda, a psychological firewall that engendered a form of loyalty, or at least tolerance, from the very community he systematically preyed upon. He presented himself as a force for order in a chaotic world, a necessary evil who maintained a brutal form of stability. It was an illusion of masterful proportions. He was not containing the chaos, he was the source of it, the quiet center of a storm of his own creation, profiting from the very instability he claimed to control. The peace he offered was the peace of the graveyard. His daily movements were a study in disciplined anonymity. He eschewed flashy cars and expensive suits, favoring a simple, unassuming lifestyle that allowed him to move through the city like a gray man, unseen and underestimated. This deliberate lack of ostentation was another layer of defense, a form of camouflage that made his immense power all the more unsettling. He was a king who chose to live among the commoners, his crown invisible to all but those who knew to look for it. At its peak, the empire was a perfectly sealed psychological bunker. Inside, Bulger operated with the serene confidence of a man who believed he had solved the fundamental equation of power. He had neutralized the law, subjugated his rivals, and mesmerized his own community. The system was no longer a threat, it was a tool, an external apparatus he could operate by remote control. The human components of his machine were chosen for their function, not their fellowship. His inner circle, including the notoriously violent Stephen Flemmi, was a collection of assets, not a brotherhood. Trust was a concept he weaponized but never felt. Alliances were temporary, transactional, and subject to termination the moment their utility expired. This emotional detachment was the source of both his strength and his profound isolation. The king inside this fortress lived in a state of perpetual low-frequency dread. The price of absolute control was absolute suspicion. Every associate was a potential traitor, every friendly gesture a possible trap, every quiet moment a prelude to betrayal. The paranoia that had been forged in Alcatraz was now the ambient air he breathed, the constant companion to his invincibility. Every interaction was a performance, every relationship a strategic calculation. He was the sole architect and sole prisoner of the world he had made. The power he had amassed did not bring freedom, but rather the burden of its constant, vigilant maintenance. The fortress had no windows from which to enjoy the view. Its walls were mirrors, reflecting only his own watchful, calculating gaze. The contrast between the quiet life he appeared to lead and the industrial-scale brutality he managed was the reign's most disturbing feature. He could share a friendly word with a neighbor in the morning, and by evening be supervising the burial of a body in a shallow grave. This seamless integration of the monstrous and the mundane was the ultimate expression of his control, a chilling testament to a psyche utterly severed from empathy. Even at the zenith of his power, he was preparing for its end. The immense profits were not just spent or laundered, they were systematically converted into a doomsday fund. Cash was buried in secret locations, false identities were meticulously crafted, and contingency plans were rehearsed in the privacy of his own mind. He was building his throne and his tomb simultaneously, a king obsessively planning his own exile. The entire magnificent, terrifying structure rested upon a single, unstable fault line, the corrupt alliance with John Connolly and the FBI. It was the pillar that held up the roof, but it was also a fissure that ran deep into the foundation. The very thing that made him feel invincible was a pact with an institution that could, at any moment, decide to save itself by sacrificing him. His reign was therefore a masterpiece of negative space, defined more by what was absent than what was present. There was no palace, only a pervasive presence. There was no throne, only a center of gravity. There was no opulence, only an absolute and terrifying control. He had built a kingdom of ghosts, ruled by a man who was, in the cold, isolated heart of his own creation, becoming one himself. No structure, however perfectly conceived, is immune to the slow, inexorable pressures of time and scrutiny. The invisible empire James Bulger had built over Boston was a marvel of corrupt engineering, but like any edifice, it rested upon foundations that were not as stable as they appeared. For years, its sheer audacity provided its greatest defense, its existence so interwoven with the city's power structures that to attack it was to attack the city itself. The silence that protected it seemed as permanent as the granite of the State House. The first tremor was not a gunshot or a rival's move, but the quiet, persistent scratching of a pen. In the newsroom of the Boston Globe, a small team of investigative reporters began to tug at a loose thread in the city's fabric. They started asking questions that had long been considered impolite, then dangerous, and finally unanswerable. They began mapping the network of fear and favor that radiated outwards from South Boston, treating the whispers of the underworld not as folklore, but as leads. These early inquiries were met with the predictable wall of institutional denial and neighborhood silence. They were dismissed as journalistic overreach, an outsider's attempt to smear a community they did not understand. Yet the questions, once asked publicly, could not be entirely unasked. They hung in the air, creating a subtle change in the city's atmosphere, a new and unwelcome frequency that interfered with the carefully controlled broadcast of the Bulger myth. This was a new form of warfare for which Bulger's arsenal was ill-equipped. He could not intimidate a headline or murder a circulation number. The threat was decentralized, a slow-acting poison entering the ecosystem he had so meticulously controlled. His power was predicated on controlling the narrative, and for the first time, a competing narrative was being written, one that cast him not as a neighborhood protector, but as the apex predator in a deeply corrupted system. While the press chipped away at the public facade, a more dangerous threat was stirring within the labyrinth of law enforcement itself. A new generation of state police and federal agents, many from outside the Boston area, began to view the Winter Hill Gang not as a managed asset, but as a sovereign criminal state operating with impossible impunity. They were immune to the old codes and unwritten agreements that had long paralyzed any real investigation. These officers started to build a parallel case, compiling evidence far from the compromised corridors of the local FBI office. They documented the extortion, traced the money, and quietly interviewed peripheral figures who were beginning to feel the ground shift beneath their feet. They were, in essence, surveyors drawing up the first legitimate blueprints of Bulger's invisible palace, mapping its true dimensions and identifying its structural weaknesses. Then, a single brick came loose from the Great Wall of Omerta. A family member of one of his victims, long suffocated by fear, found their voice. Empowered by the growing media scrutiny, they began to speak publicly about their loss, refusing to let the official silence be the final word. Their grief became a weapon, a single point of moral pressure applied to a structure that had no morality of its own. This small act of defiance created a hairline fracture in the collective silence. It suggested that speaking out was no longer a certain death sentence. Others, emboldened, began to share their stories, not with the police they inherently distrusted, but with the journalists who were now listening. The mortar of fear, which had held the neighborhood's silence together for decades, was beginning to dry and crumble. Within the Empire's command center, the change was palpable. Bulger, a man who thrived on being the sole arbiter of information, now found himself the subject of it. The whispers he had once curated were now carrying rumors of investigations and potential witnesses. The flow of intelligence, the lifeblood of his control, was becoming contaminated with uncertainty and the threat of exposure. His legendary paranoia, long a finely tuned instrument of survival, began to curdle into a cruder, more defensive form. He looked upon his own inner circle with a renewed and venomous suspicion. Every lieutenant was a potential point of failure, every associate a possible informant. The The human architecture of his organization, built on the transactional loyalty of fear, was now a liability. The atmosphere in the backroom of the South Boston Liquor Mart, his unofficial throne room, grew heavy with unspoken tension. The casual arrogance of absolute power gave way to the grim focus of a war council. The discussions were no longer about expansion, but about containment. The invisible fortress was no longer a platform for projecting power, but a bunker preparing for a long and desperate siege. The two great pillars supporting the entire edifice began to groan under the strain. At the FBI, John Connolly's position was becoming untenable. His unusually close relationship with his prized informants was drawing scrutiny from internal affairs and the Department of Justice. The very asset that had made his career was now threatening to destroy it. He was no longer the master key to the system. He was a walking, talking piece of evidence. In the State House, the gilded shield of his brother's political power began to tarnish. William Bulger's immense influence could still deflect many blows, but it could not make the story disappear. The name Bulger was being publicly redefined, shifting from a symbol of Irish-American political ascendancy to a synonym for organized crime and corruption. The political insulation was eroding. It was in this climate of decay that federal prosecutors, unencumbered by local allegiances, prepared their final assault. They invoked the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, or RICO, a legal weapon designed not merely to convict criminals, but to dismantle their empires. It was an architectural tool of demolition, perfectly suited for bringing down a structure as vast and complex as the Winter Hill Gang. Their investigation was methodical and relentless, a slow-motion implosion of the world Bulger had built. They gathered evidence, flipped minor players, and pieced together a comprehensive portrait of a criminal enterprise that had been allowed to fester for 2 decades. They were not just building a case. They were preparing to condemn the entire building. The legal machinery was moving, its gears grinding inexorably toward a conclusion. Secret grand jury proceedings were held. Indictments were drafted and sealed. The ghost that had haunted Boston for so long was about to be captured on paper. His name and crimes formally entered into the official record, stripping him of the anonymity that had been his greatest armor. The final warnings trickled down through the compromised networks Bulger and Flemmi still maintained. The whispers became more urgent, the news more specific. Their sources within law enforcement were either going silent or advising them that the end was near. The system they had so brilliantly parasitized was finally developing an immune response. John Connolly, caught between the collapsing worlds of his past and his future, faced the ultimate test of his corrupted loyalties. To protect himself, he would have to sever his connection to the man he had protected for so long. The symbiotic relationship that had built an empire was about to end in a final, desperate act of betrayal. The indictment was a fact. It was sealed, but it was real. It named Stephen Flemmi. It named others in the crew. And it named James J. Bulger. The institutional shield that had rendered him untouchable had not just been lowered. It had been repurposed into the cage that would soon hold him. The warning came, a frantic and final communication from a disgraced agent to his criminal counterpart. The game was over. The warrants were coming. The invisible fortress, with its walls of fear and its pillars of corruption, had been breached beyond repair. In that moment, the King of South Boston ceased to be a ruler and became what he had always been preparing to be, a ghost on the run. The end of an empire rarely announces itself with the blast of a cannon. More often, it begins with a whisper, a single piece of information traveling along an unexpected channel, a quiet betrayal that unlocks the gates from within. For the king in apartment W 303, the fatal breach came not from a rival gangster or a compromised associate, but from the casual observation of a neighbor, a face seen on a television screen, a flicker of recognition, a phone call to a federal hotline. These were the humble tools that brought the entire edifice of his 16-year exile crashing down. The federal task force, galvanized by this single credible lead, did not descend upon the Princess Eugenia apartments with the brute force of a tactical assault. The final move was a reflection of the target himself, quiet, methodical, and psychologically astute. They understood that the fortress was not the apartment's physical structure, but the meticulous routine and anonymity of its occupant. The plan was not to breach the door, but to lure the ghost out of his own machine. On a placid Santa Monica morning, under a sky of indifferent blue, the agents took their positions. They were not clad in black armor, but in the unremarkable attire of maintenance workers and building management. They moved with a practiced calm, their presence absorbed into the building's mundane daily rhythm. Inside apartment 303, the man known as Charles Gasco was likely engaged in the same disciplined routine that had kept him free for nearly 2 decades. Unaware that the architecture of his life was about to be condemned, the approach was a masterpiece of deception. A carefully crafted story about a break-in at the building's storage units was the bait. It was a problem that would concern any resident, a subtle, plausible disruption to the established order that required his attention. He was being drawn out not by force, but by the irresistible pull of domestic responsibility, the very role he had perfected as his ultimate disguise. The predator was being hunted with the tactics of a homeowner. When he stepped out of his apartment and into the garage to inspect his locker, the trap closed with a silent, devastating efficiency. There was no shootout, no desperate last stand. The man who had terrorized a city and eluded a global manhunt was surrounded by federal agents before he could comprehend the finality of the moment. The reign of Whitey Bulger ended not with a bang, but with the quiet, metallic click of handcuffs in a subterranean parking structure. The king had been disarmed and captured, his fortress breached without a single shot fired. With the fugitive secured, the apartment itself became the target. The door to the 303, once a shield for a monstrous secret, was now a portal into a historical artifact. Teams of federal agents swarmed the space, the sterile silence of 16 years shattered by the methodical noise of a forensic search. The quiet, unassuming residence was officially declared a crime scene. Its mundane contents instantly transformed into evidence of a meticulously constructed lie. The process was an architectural autopsy. Agents began to dismantle the life of Charles Gasco, piece by painstaking piece. The paperback books were taken from shelves, their pages fanned for hidden notes. The modest furniture was shifted, its undersides examined. The ceramic figurines, silent witnesses to a life of profound deception, were lifted and inspected. Every object that had served as a prop in his long-running performance was now catalogued, photographed, and bagged. But the true secrets of this space were not on the surface. The agents knew that the apartment's most important function was that of a vault. They began to sound the walls, their gloved hands tapping against the drywall, listening for the telltale hollow resonance of a hidden cavity. The thin, unassuming partitions that had separated his fabricated life from his violent past were about to be systematically violated. The first incision was made with a utility knife, a clean, deliberate slice through the layers of white paint in a bedroom closet. The act was profoundly symbolic, the physical piercing of the veil that had concealed a killer in plain sight. Drywall dust, like desiccated bone, fell to the cheap carpet as a section of the wall was carefully removed, exposing the dark, secret space within. From this wound in the architecture, the ghosts of Boston began to emerge. The first object pulled from the darkness was a handgun, wrapped in a plastic bag. Then another and another. A deadly arsenal, meticulously maintained and ready for use, was exhumed from its domestic tomb. The instruments of his former power had been nesting just inches from where he slept, a latent violence embedded in the very structure of his sanctuary. The demolition continued in the bathroom. Behind the vanity mirror, another section of the wall was cut away to reveal the Empire's pension fund. Stacks of $100 bills, bound in aging rubber bands, were packed tightly into the cavity. It was the physical residue of a reign of terror, the profits of extortion and murder, converted into a silent, waiting fortune of over $800,000. The apartment was being turned inside out, its architectural lies exposed to the harsh light of justice. The search was a process of inversion, revealing that the true nature of the space was contained not within its visible dimensions, but within the hidden voids of its construction. The walls, his final and most trusted co-conspirators, were confessing everything they had been forced to hold in silence. Every mundane surface was now suspect. Floorboards were pried up, Light fixtures were dismantled, and the backs of appliances were inspected. The entire apartment was treated as a single, complex piece of contraband. The illusion of normalcy was so complete that it had to be destroyed to be understood, its components disassembled to prove the monstrosity of the whole. The contrast was absolute. The contents of the room spoke of a quiet, frugal retirement. The contents of the walls screamed of a life of industrial-scale crime and brutal violence. The apartment was a paradox made physical, a space that had successfully hosted two mutually exclusive realities, and now, in its ruin, it was finally being forced into a single, horrifying coherence. As the agents worked, the space was physically destroyed. Holes gaped in the walls like open wounds. Wires and insulation spilled from the cavities. The dust of deconstruction settled over everything, a fine grey powder that seemed like the ashes of the lie that had been incinerated. The bunker had been shelled, its fortifications reduced to rubble. The final inventory was a portrait of a predator in hibernation, an arsenal of 30 firearms, from pistols to shotguns, alongside a collection of hunting knives and ammunition. Bundles of cash, a library of false identities, each with its own meticulously crafted backstory. These were not the relics of a forgotten past. They were the tools of a man who was always prepared for his old life to come roaring back. When the search was complete, the apartment stood as a gutted testament to its own failure. The hollowed-out walls, the dismembered furniture, the forensic dust, all that remained was the raw, structural evidence of a collapsed world. The power of the space had been its perfect facade, and once that was torn away, there was nothing left but a ruined stage and the memory of the monster who had haunted it. So where does power truly reside? In concrete, or in what survives its fall? Subscribe to explore the legacies left behind in the ruins of ambition. The story of a fortress does not end with its breach, but with the silence that follows. After the federal agents departed, apartment 303 was left a hollowed-out carcass, its walls gaping with the wounds of discovery. The air, once thick with the tension of a 16-year lie, was now thin and acrid with the dust of drywall and the ghosts of excavated secrets. The space was no longer a bunker or a home. It was an artifact, a ruin catalogued and abandoned, its purpose extinguished in the moment its truth was revealed. Then came the restorers, the professionals of erasure. With chemical solvents and fresh coats of sterile white paint, they worked to scrub the psychic residue from the walls. Their labor was a final, institutional act of denial, an attempt to return the space to its intended state of absolute neutrality. They were sealing a tomb, not just painting a room, layering a bland present over a monstrous past in the hope that the new surface would hold. The apartment was eventually returned to the anonymous churn of the Santa Monica rental market. A new number was perhaps affixed to the door, the locks were changed, and a listing appeared online describing ocean breezes and convenient access to the promenade. Its history was not a selling point, but a silent liability, a story absorbed back into the city's vast indifference. The property, once a character in a dark drama, was forced back into its role as a simple commodity, a set of rooms for rent. Today, the Princess Eugenia apartments still bake under the Pacific sun, a monument to the mundane that has successfully outlived the monster it once housed. New tenants inhabit apartment 303, their lives unfolding in a space that was the final redoubt of a fallen king. They hang pictures on walls that once concealed an arsenal, and sleep in a room that once contained a fortune in blood money, likely unaware that their home is a quiet museum to a collapsed world. The man who had been Charles Gasco was returned to the world as James Bulger, his carefully constructed anonymity stripped away under the glare of courtroom lights. The trial was the final, public demolition of his myth. The quiet, disciplined fugitive was gone, replaced by a defiant, snarling old man, a caged predator whose only remaining power was the venom in his words. The secrets he had guarded for a lifetime were laid bare, his reign of terror detailed in the dry, methodical language of legal testimony. He was convicted on 31 counts, found culpable in 11 murders, and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, plus 5 years. The judgment was absolute, a final and irreversible loss of the control that had been his life's obsession. He was no longer a phantom or a king, but a number in the federal prison system, his existence reduced to the stark architecture of a concrete cell, a final, ironic echo of his time in Alcatraz. His end came not in a hail of gunfire or on his own terms, but in the sordid brutality of a prison transfer. Less than 12 hours after arriving at USP Hazleton, a high-security penitentiary in West Virginia, the 89-year-old was beaten to death by fellow inmates. The man who had orchestrated so many calculated theatrical murders died in a crude, anonymous act of violence, his life extinguished with the same casual cruelty he had once perfected. The empire of fear that had once held a city captive concluded as a brief, bloody headline, a final, pathetic postscript to a life of methodical evil. The ghost of South Boston was exorcised, not by the law he had so expertly manipulated, but by the primitive code of the world to which he was ultimately returned. His death was the final erasure, the reduction of a terrifying legend to a simple, unceremonious fact. The apartment in Santa Monica, however, endures. Its legacy is not carved into its structure, but exists in the narrative it now anchors. The walls, once the silent keepers of a deadly secret, are now just walls, their symbolic weight having been transferred to the story itself. They no longer contain the latent violence of the past. They merely separate one ordinary life from another, their great secret told, spent and forgotten by the building itself. Two fortresses defined his life, the invisible empire of influence and fear he built across Boston, and the invisible bunker of anonymity he constructed in Santa Monica. One was an architecture of absolute presence, the other of absolute absence. Both were masterpieces of a sociopathic mind, designed for total control, and both were ultimately fragile, built on foundations of betrayal that were destined to collapse. Perhaps what we build, whether a palace of corruption or a sanctuary of lies, says less about the power we command than about our terror of being erased. Every wall erected, every secret buried within it, is a defense against the void, a desperate attempt to impose a design upon a world that will, in the end, reclaim all materials for its own. In the sun-bleached landscape of Santa Monica, a three-story building of white stucco stands as a testament to the power of the unremarkable. It is a place built for lives that come and go, leaving no trace. But for those who know the story, its anonymous facade is no longer a shield but a question, a quiet reminder that the most impenetrable walls are the ones we never notice are there at all. If stories like this make you see power from a different angle, subscribe to follow other downfalls as astonishing as this one.